What is up, guys? Parida here from TechnoBuffalo, and as some of you may or may not know, I create, shoot, edit a lot of the content you guys see on the TechnoBuffalo YouTube channel. I also have been a commercial director over the last couple of years doing automotive commercial work, and I also create a short documentary series called The Happiness Stories. The reason I'm saying this is that I wake up every morning and I look at Adobe Premiere or any editing software, and I pretty much go to sleep looking at that same editing software. It's a little bit annoying, honestly. Different story for another day. So I would consider myself an industry professional or a pro user. I rely on these tools, hardware and software, to make a living. And pretty much since the beginning of my career, I've used Apple hardware and software, mainly because of Final Cut Pro. Over the last probably 5 to 10 years, Apple has really begun to drop the ball when it comes to their pro users and their needs. If you guys remember a time when Apple wasn't the biggest company in the world and didn't make the iPhone, their core user base was really graphic designers and photographers and filmmakers and animators and all of the above. However, as they've begun to grow in the consumer space, they've really grown to neglect that core user base. And that's what I'm going to be a little bit, maybe a lot, angry about today. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first sign we saw a couple of years ago was when Apple neglected to update the Mac Pro. Now, it happened, it just took forever. We were stuck with a really old design, really old processor, and yes, it was modular, but it just showed a lack of effort from Apple's end. Now, this sort of has transitioned into the lack of a cinema display today. So when Apple did announce their Mac Pro, they were really proud of the fact of how many 4K displays they could output to, but Apple doesn't make a 4K display. Now, sure, you can get third parties, but the fact that they haven't even bothered to update their cinema display, which is now like this fat, and is fatter than the iMac, which makes no sense, that's a different story for a different conversation, it's just a sign as to the fact that they're not trying to really cater to their pro users. Another example was when Apple dropped their 17-inch MacBook Pro. Now, yes, this wasn't the most portable machine, but it was a great desktop replacement for a lot of photographers, a lot of graphic designers, a lot of video editors. The large display made it a little bit difficult to carry around, but it made it worth it and easier when you were editing and creating photos and just doing your thing. This also blends into what they did with displays, which was go from matte to glossy. Now, in the middle there, they did have the option to pick during checkout, but now you can't even get a matte display. For those of you who don't know, the reason you want a matte display if you're a video editor or photographer or something is because glossy displays actually distort what your color space really is. It makes images more saturated than they actually are. It brings blacks much deeper than they actually are, so it doesn't give you an accurate depiction of what you're color grading or what you're editing, which is incredibly annoying. And that brings me on to one of the this was probably the most public dropping of the ball Apple had in terms of their pro product. Final Cut Pro X or 10 or whatever you want to call it, or as I call it, iMovie on steroids. When this was first released, we saw just a massive drop off of features. This was when I immediately switched from Final Cut Pro 7 to Adobe Premiere. There's very little flexibility within the software, and that's probably the best way I can explain it. A professional piece of software works for you. So at the office, we have myself, we have Andrew, we have Mark. We're all working on editing, and we all work in different ways, but we can customize Adobe Premiere to work for us. Final Cut Pro X forces you to work in the way that Apple thinks you should be working, which is a very sort of hobbyist way of approaching editing, and it really makes everyone's life much more difficult when you rely on their software to make a living. And this really bothers me because if you go on Apple's website, like today, they're still advertising themselves as if they're for like artists. On their homepage it says, look at what artists have made with all these Apple products. And sure, they're regular consumers, and I'm not saying regular consumers can't make art. I'm just saying there's a big difference for professionals who rely day in and day out for something to work and work efficiently, for them to be able to pay their rent and make a living and pay their bills. And there's a difference between someone who's a hobbyist and who doesn't have deadlines to hit and who doesn't have clients and huge budgets waiting for them to deliver a product. And I'm gonna keep going. You have the iPad Pro. This is just an abomination in my opinion. Not the product itself, but the fact that it's called an iPad Pro. What is pro about it? You could say it's a great device or not a great device depending on who you are, and that's a different conversation. But the truth is that on iOS, there's no way you're making that a pro device. No professional graphic designer is walking to work with just an iPad Pro saying, this is all I use. It may be something they use in conjunction, but to pitch it as a pro product when it's running iOS really is just false marketing in my opinion. I don't know if Apple's trying to make their regular consumers feel more professional than they are, or if they've just not cared. to fix their Pro line or rename or rebrand. And finally, the Whopper, the last one. I mean, honestly, I could keep going on and on and on. You have Aperture, which they dropped Aperture, didn't replace with anything. Ralph at our office has to switch to Lightroom, just another example. But the Whopper to me is that the 13-inch MacBook Pro that you buy today comes in with a 5,400 RPM drive. It's 2016. Please tell me what industry professional can use a 5,400 RPM drive and get much done. 7,200 would be one conversation, but to be honest, if it's a Pro device, it should have an SSD. Not necessarily PCIe, but SSD at least. So that's it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening to me yell and complain for what felt like an hour. I'm actually going to smile now. Leave us a comment below with your thoughts. I'm really curious as to what you guys think. If I'm the only one who's this angry, leave us a thumbs up if you're happy and you like this video. Hit subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.